right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the multiple exposure contest entry results. We're going to start with Tim Peters' submittal. Now, this is not going to jump off the page as being a multiple exposure, and that's because that was done really well. So, give you a second if you can figure out what the multiple exposure was here. Now, when I first saw this before reading Tim's note, I thought it was the way that the person was in the image because it kind of looks like the shadows are going through them. But no, the moon is the second exposure. So it was first exposure, wait for the moon to come into frame, take the second exposure. So that's how this image was achieved. Great result, by the way. It's an image that doesn't look like a multiple exposure, but is and captured the scene that Tim wanted to create, even though he needed two different events or two different moments in time to capture it. Very well done. I also really liked the overall image structure and composition, the way that even though this is a nighttime photo, it's pretty well illuminated and you can really see what's going on with the scene. And the fact that there's a person in there, even though they're very blurry, I think really adds a nice element of interest to the overall image. So this one comes to us from Richard Mander, and I'll admit I've struggled to figure out exactly what the multiple exposure in this image was. The best bet that I have is that the bird is superimposed in the image to create this look, or the specific image. So if that's the case, it is done exceedingly well, and I didn't see any signs of it being pasted in when I looked through when I looked up close at the photo. So I do like the overall image composition, and I think photographing birds, especially owls or kites or falcons, I'm not sure exactly what that is, at sunset is generally a good recipe for success. This next photo is from Rod Stewart, and this is a double exposure of a person writing with a letter, and then the background of it is the what looks like burlap with some rose petals on it. And so we can take away from that, even without being able to read all the text, that this is probably an image that's doing something to discuss a love letter. So one general rule about photography is that if you have text in an image, whether it's a word or a lot of words, takes away from the viewer's ability to focus on the image portions of the image, because the brain is just drawn to trying to read what that text says. So in this case, we have a lot of the text in the letter that can't be read just because of the way that the image turned out. So that was one thing I struggled with this photo. In terms of the important parts of the image, the thought process behind it, the ideas that went into it, the technical execution of the lighting in it, and also the planning that clearly went into the way that this image was structured. All of that's done very well. So, and those are the things that are really hard to nail down. The difference between using something that has text that we try to read versus something that doesn't use text that we try to read, that's just an execution and a thing. The hard parts that went into this are all done very, very well. This photo is from Samuel West, and it's a multiple exposure that was part of his architecture series from this year. And I'm trying to figure out exactly how many exposures it was. It looks like 2. And I can't tell it. It looks like 2 with a little bit of overlap of the next frame on the right, which is why I was a little bit thrown by that at first. But I suspect that what we're seeing here is the building and then brickwork that's in that specific building. So I'm assuming that this is a double exposure of that specific building. And one of the things that I really like here is that the building is turned on its side. So the brickwork is going at a different angle from the building. So one of the things I would do were I to have the opportunity were this my photo and I were going to go back and try to look at different ways it could be revisioned, is right now it looks like the exposure was roughly evenly split between the two photos. I might try biasing the exposure towards the different photos differently. So for instance, if you were to take away 1/3 of a stop of light from one photo and 2/3 from the other one, and vice versa. How would that affect it? How would the image be affected if you tilted the camera at different angles for each of the two different photos? How about combining those two different factors? So this would be one of those images that, if you wanted to try to recreate it, would absolutely be worth spending an entire roll of film on. Sit down, plan out the different exposure biases, even biasing the exposure to one or more. Which angles would you try to recapture the structure at? And then seeing how those different factors and variables combine to create a different image outcome. And that, I think, not only could, I think that could be a pretty good experiment as well. Honestly, it sounds kind of fun, so I might do that myself also. Anyway, I did think also that the most interesting part of this photo was where there's no sky. So if you look in that center part of the photo where you've got the most contrast and color and texture and detail of the bricks, where they overlap the building, and where you don't have that bright white angle of light from the sky on the wall, and you don't have the blueness of the sky that's to the right of what would be the top of the building. That is, I think, the most visually compelling part of this image, because you're getting the texture of the bricks with the building. So that's the thing that made me think, oh, well, hey, what if that building received 2/3 of the proper amount of light, and the bricks only received 1/3? How would that cause the texture of the bricks to appear in the overall building? So anyway, just a couple of things to think about with that shot. This photo comes from Chris May, and it doesn't look like a multiple exposure, but if you look at the water, you can see that it is. And this is basically a shot that took some number of photos, and I know he told me how many, and I can't remember now, to create a smoothness, it's a texture and a smoothness both at the same time, sort of, in the water. And then you've got the Chicago skyline in the background. So really good image composition, good use of depth of field. We have that cleat at the very front, and then the distant skyline, and then the even more distant clouds. Then a very nice level horizon line, really good uses of colors, because you've got a mix of warm tone, cool tone, and earth tone colors throughout here, and all of them are generally kind of muted. There's nothing here that's super bold or overstated. And then a really good use of lighting, because you've got an angle of light coming from behind the photographer, illuminating the buildings, telling us that this is, let's see, knowing Chicago, I'm going to guess that that's probably pretty darn close to sunrise, because the sun looks like it's coming from the east. So at any rate, lots and lots of really good elements in this photo that go to create a really, really pleasing skyline result that includes the Sears Tower, and I will go to my grave calling it the Sears Tower. This next photo comes from Danny Flewelling, and this is a multiple exposure, and I'm struggling to figure out exactly how many. I'm going to guess this is 4 photos with the same subject being rotated 3 different ways, and then a photo of a texture as well. Now, were I making this photo, the way that I would do it is I would have a plain black backdrop. I'd have the subject stand over on the left as they are, rotate, have them take a step to the right as they are, and then rotate and have them take another step, and then capture the edge of their face as was done here, and then take that frame and go out and shoot some sort of textured background with it. So, or have it, that sort of textured background somewhere at hand that I could use. At any rate, that's how I would do it. I'm guessing that's how this photo was taken. And when you do multiple exposures, if you want to experiment with them, one thing that's really interesting to try is black and white backgrounds. So for instance, if you think about the film negative, right? A black background becomes a clear part of the negative. A white background will become a black part of the negative. So if you use a white background first, anything that is in the second exposure that was in that white background won't be recorded very well. But if you use a black background first, anything in the second exposure that was in that area where the black background was will come through without any sort of issue whatsoever. As we can see here in this example, where for instance, the skin of the subject doesn't allow as much information about this textured part of the image to come through as the black areas of the image do. So I think that's a really good and interesting use of the way that film records light to create a multiple exposure. Good instinct there. So this photo is from Diego Leone, and it shows two exposures. A photo of a person who's reading the water, the warning that the water is not safe for drinking, as well as clouds. And so the message that I get from this image is it is telling a story that the water at hand, at this fountain, is not safe to drink. But there's water in the sky that is. So why is it that if we get free water from the sky that is safe to drink, that we can't have safe to drink water for everybody here with what we've already been given? So I think that's a really good question to ask, and I do definitely hope that's the question that's being asked with this image. Also really happen to like the way that the image is structured, where the cloud portion of the double exposure hides the person. Like, really, it just looks like it's kind of a hand coming out of the clouds. And also the way that the lighting coming from below the fountain portion of it casts a shadow of the water and the spigots back up onto the fountains, as well as it looks like the person's hand is having their shadow cast onto that other spigot. So kind of hard to tell, but really enjoyed the way that this image's structure had something to say, or conveyed a message that the photographer had to say. For our honorable mentions, we're going to start here with Jonathan Mayberry, who created this double exposure. Was kind of a challenge for me to figure out. Okay, so it looks like what happened is that there's something very dark in the foreground, probably either a very dark water body or maybe just an intentional blocking of the film. Hard to tell. So I guess it could be a digital image, but it has a bit of a film look to it. Actually, yeah, looking at the enlarged version, it is definitely a film photo. And also, seeing it enlarged, in the bottom right corner, there are some reeds that are underwater or some grasses. So you can see that, yes, it is, in fact, that there is a very dark body of water in the foreground of the image. So what it looks like he did was take a photo, rotate the camera 180 degrees, and take another photo. And so all of the areas that were bright in the first photo, which would be the sky, right, those blew out the film so that what was dark in the foreground of the lake didn't come through, and vice versa. So that's why you have the clouds of the sky showing through very well in the foreground. Now, how do we know it's not a reflection? Because of the way that the trees overlap. So you can see how the trees are sort of coming together, and so that means that the camera wasn't perfectly rotated 180 degrees. It was turned 180 degrees and either pointed up or down for the second shot. And that resulted in the trees overlapping, and it also resulted in the shoreline of the pond being very well obscured within the blurring of the boundaries of the trees and the water body. So I think that's something that a lot of large format photographers have done over the years. And I remember reading a large format photography book where a professional photographer was talking about, he had this idea to take a picture of a city skyline, and it would be at night. So the river or whatever in the front would be completely black. And if he stood under a bridge, and if he took a picture of the bridge lights going out to the city skyline, and then the city skyline itself, and he put the boundary between the lake and the skyline in the exact middle, he knew he could rotate the film back 180 degrees and get everything to line up perfectly. Right? Yeah, not quite that easy. So he did it with slide film, and I forget if he said, or if the book said that he took 10 or 15 attempts, and one of them worked perfectly. So just as he had wanted it. And so that's something that's a good instinct, is to take a scene and rotate it and overlap it, because it can generally have a really interesting composition, because not only is it upside down, it's also mirrored. So very, very interesting structure there. Our next honorable mention is from Stephen Boyce, and this is a photo of a fun weekend, we can see. So no, but joking aside, so what we have here is a double exposure of a subject standing in front of an illuminated backdrop, and then there's the pill bottles on the floor. So the backdrop texture doesn't appear to overlap itself at all. So I'm going to guess that the first photo was taken and then the subject moved a bit, probably, my instinct tells me that they probably kicked the bottles around a little bit with their foot, although some of them are lined up pretty darn close to perfectly. So anyway, it's hard for me to tell for sure whether or not the camera position was changed between photos, but I'm going to guess not. But definitely the model changed positions a little bit. So we ended up with the person having, slightly overlapping. Where it's most obvious throughout, right? But where I think it's most interesting is in the person's face, because what's happened is that she has slightly different expressions for the two different photos. And you can see that really in her eyebrows. Eyebrows don't lie. It's true of acting. It's true of talking to someone. It's true of photos. Person's eyebrows will tell you much more about their emotions that they're feeling than any other part of their face, okay? So we can see that there's a difference in her eyebrows in the way that she's looking at either the photographer or the camera between the two photos. So I think for me, the most interesting part of this photo is where her face overlaps in the two multiple exposures and the slightly different expression there. Be interesting to go back and revisit this type of photo with completely different types of expression. So we're doing maybe more of like a shoulder up portrait in this vein with different types of expressions as well. So, or telling jokes between the two different photos or something like that. So, anyway, just some things to think about. I thought that the way that the two different images in this photo worked together to show two different sides of the subject was very interesting. All right, our runner-up for the 120 roll of Fuji color film is from Frank Wuters. And this is a photo that I spent a long time looking at because it looks like it feels like it's like a photo that could be telling the story of a set place over a whole range of time, right? And I sat down to try to count how many photos are actually in this frame. And I think I counted 13 discrete photos. And Frank, I'd be interested to know whether or not I got that right. But we have, most obviously, the people on the steps. We have a pickup, or a van, rather, in the middle. We have a building. We have some sort of thing that's horizontal and giving texture, something with leaves. We have another building over on the right side. I don't think that's the same photo. It could be the same photo as the left. There's some converging lines going on there. Then there's another photo, another building, which is really, really, really faint. You can see some of the windows up in the sky. Anyway, I don't remember all of the different photos that I counted, but there's different ones that are at different orientations and they overlap differently. And it also looks like it also looks like the photo of the people in the stairs there was either given the most exposure or because the rest of the photos that just happened to be where there was shadow detail, they come through the best. Actually, probably more of the latter option of those. Any rate, what I couldn't tell you is whether or not there was a lot of exposure compensation done here, or if Frank just hit the film with as much light as it could possibly manage. Either way, I think it's a really good result because it's full of chaos and it forces the viewer to look at it for a long time to figure out what's going on in it, and it forces the mind to ask, what are all these different things I'm seeing photos of, and start piecing them out and taking the whole image apart. It's just it's such fun chaos. And the category winner is from Arvind, probably my second favorite photo of the entire contest right here. This is one I stared at for a long time. And I thought, originally thought he'd submitted this for intentional blur. And like my brain started to sizzle because the birds are motionless. So what I really, really like about this photo is that the subject is blurry. And whether the photographer had him standing there and intentionally moving, or that was happenstance, I couldn't tell you, but the subject is intentionally blurry. And then he's surrounded by this scene that is taken with such a fast exposure that there is no blur in these birds' wings. So not only is Arvind in here playing with a double exposure, he's also playing with the way that time can be captured in two completely different ways with a camera in the same frame. And I think that's like really advanced thinking. This is not just here's this double exposure. It's here's time. Here's different ways of capturing it. And in one of the other videos, I said, good photos are never taken at a 60th of a second, asterisk. Here are two photos, neither of which were taken at a 60th of a second. Long exposure, very fast exposure. So lots and lots of great thought going into this. The thing that gets me about this is that it's a film photo. Like you can tell by the grain and like a couple of stray little bits of dust on it that this is a film photo, which the only way I can think of that this would have been made would have been to take the photo in the real world, then come back into the studio and have the subject in front of a black backdrop for a long exposure. But then the question that I keep struggling with is none of the background behind the subject makes it through the subject. Like the barrier behind him, the skyline, that white line in the road that's going into his right sleeve. None of that is in the subject. Like this is one I spent like an hour trying to figure out how this would be done. And the only thing I can think of would be that was the technique, and that the lighting on the second exposure of the person was so bright that that his shirt blocked out all of the details of what was in the scene behind him. Really, really good capture, just from a visually compelling standpoint, from a technical standpoint, and also from the way that it tells a story about the way that photographers can play with time in the same image. And it is so beautifully surreal. Really, really enjoyed this photo. Well done.